Hey, how you doing? It's Clayton here from howtodrawcomics.net and welcome to today's video. In this demonstration, I'm going to be doing up a couple headshots for the character I did for a concept a week or so back, actually. You might have seen me post it up here to the channel. In fact, we did an entire character concept, and that was for a comic book idea that I'd come up with that had been floating around inside my mind for who knows how long, like months and months and months. And that's usually what happens for me, is if an idea is worth keeping, usually it'll stick around and kind of develop in the back of my mind until it cannot be tamed any longer. It's just got to come out on the page. And that's kind of what ended up happening. And so I decided to start creating one of the main characters as a concept by drawing them up onto the page. And in this particular video, what is happening is I'm kind of zooming in a little closer and starting to articulate the finer details and intricacies of exactly how that character is going to look. And because the head is, one of the main points of reference for a character, that's what I'm going to be focused on in this demonstration. It's kind of one of the most important aspects of a character that you may have heard me harp on about before, but it's just, again, when your audience is seeing a character for the first time and they're taking in your book and they're being exposed to the cast of characters that are going to be present within your story, the first place in which they're going to look, the first thing that their eyes are going to lock onto is the eyes of your character. And, that's why eyes are so important to draw. But as you know, eyes are going to be found on the face. And so it's the face which the audience will begin looking at and taking in after they're done with the eyes and kind of looking at them. And then they're going to make their way around the rest of the character after that, right? So it kind of starts with the head first, and then the audience is going to take in the rest, which is why the head is kind of like the first impression that the audience is going to get for our characters. So it's really, really important that we get it right, which is why when you're first coming up in the game as an aspiring comic book artist, one of the first things that you want to get really good at, and you'll end up focusing on this intuitively just because you know how important it is naturally, the first thing we're going to focus on is getting really, really good at drawing heads. Now, it can take a very long time to be able to draw a head competently, because heads are one of those things that it's very easy to tell if something is off about them, if there is a lack of symmetry, if the facial features are not proportional in relation to one another, if they haven't been placed onto the face in a way which actually makes it look like the features are part of the face instead of just being glued on top of it like some kind of, mask, as if the features have literally just been drawn onto some kind of flat plane, not a fat plane, a flat plane on the front of the face. And although the head can be broken up into planes, and you'll see that I've somewhat done that in the underlying structure, that's not really what you want to do. You want to kind of imply that the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and the ears, every feature that you're placing onto the head looks as though it's part of it, like it's built into it. And so now that I've got the foundations done, we kind of sped through that, turned that to blue, added in the facial features, and now onto the refinement process already. The head doesn't really take me that long to draw up anymore just because I've done it so many darn times. Why have I done it so many times? Because I wasn't that great at drawing them in the beginning. It took me a long time, and I think one of the things that really messed me up, that caused me to take longer to draw heads in a competent way, was that I wasn't drawing them right in the first place. I'd kind of locked on to this particular technique, this method, I guess you'd call it, that simply wasn't allowing me to execute my heads correctly. The proportions and the way that I was breaking it up just weren't accurate. So every time I would execute this process, it'd lead me to a head that wasn't actually proportionally accurate. And so I had to kind of change that up. And once you've learned a particular way of doing something, it can be quite difficult to get onto something else and start to learn how to go about it in a different way. And so I had to do that, and it took a little while to become comfortable with it, because you kind of have to let go of that old process, and then you've got to learn the new one and become comfortable with it. And it feels weird at first, it feels foreign, but then you get used to it, and what is worse is you're not that great at it in the beginning. If you're following along with this video and you're kind of trying to put into practice what it is you're seeing me demonstrate on the screen here, if you've never taken this approach before, it's going to feel uncomfortable. It's not going to feel quite right. And the end result that you're going to be seeing on the page may not be perfect. It may not look like anything that you're seeing on the screen here because, of course, to properly implement this stuff and to really harness it, you've got to practice it multiple times. But it's discouraging when you've practiced it so little that you're not seeing those results just yet. And so there is a certain level of patience that you've got to have when it comes to actually getting better, to improving upon your skills, because sometimes the results aren't going to come till later. In fact, it may take some time for you to start seeing anything at all. So you can see that in the front view of this character's face, or head as a whole, really, because it's not just the face that I'm working on here that I'm trying to figure out. I'm focusing on the entire head, the hairstyle, the way that the bone structure underneath the skin is going to be presented to the viewer. Again, the jawline. This is going to be various parts of the character that are going to make them recognizable as this character specifically. The head shape really comes into play in a big way there when it comes to recognizing and making a distinction between individual characters. It ultimately comes down to the proportions, not necessarily the way in which the facial features are drawn themselves, or, your line work, or even the way that the hair is styled, although hair does have a significant impact on how the character is interpreted ultimately and how recognizable they become. It plays an important role, of course. In fact, it plays probably one of the most important roles. However, the proportions of the head and how they are essentially, how the facial features are related to one another and then sized up, that's really what is going to allow you to, one, figure out what those measurements are, what the sizes of the facial features are going to be, and where the facial features are going to be placed in comparison to one another, and then be able to replicate those variables onto the head every time you draw it from that point onward. Okay, so this is one of the key things that most people struggle with, specifically comic book artists, when it comes to drawing characters over and over again, is that they have trouble capturing the likeness of that character more than once. And so, they'll draw a really great looking character, they'll be happy with the concept and the way that it looks, but then when they go to try and draw it again, it won't look like the same character. And it's usually because they haven't really properly gotten stone the correct proportions or a consistent measurement for those proportions that is specific to that character. And when you can really nail that down, then you can replicate it again and again, and you will find that, ultimately you're able to capture that character in a way which is recognizable to the viewer. And really that's what matters. You might recognize the character and you might understand that it's them, but if the viewer doesn't, then there's a problem, right? There's going to be a disconnect. They're not going to understand what it is they're looking at. They might think that the character you're showing them, even though they might have experienced that character before, even if it's the main character, they may not realize that it's actually the character that they're supposed to be looking at. They might think it's someone else completely different. So you really have to be mindful of that stuff, and that's one of the reasons as to why when it comes to actually creating a character concept, which is what I'm doing here, I'm getting down to the nitty-gritty details, the nuances of this character and how they're going to look, who they're going to be visually. One of the most important reasons as to why you want to do that is so that you've got some kind of point of reference there that you can refer back to when it comes to redrawing this character from one panel to the next in your comic book. And so, that's why I'm kind of, I'm trying to go for a few different angles here. If you saw the video that we did up last week of the concept of the character showing his full body, and you saw a few really rough head sketches that I did of him initially there as well. I'll link to that video, by the way, in the description just below this video so that you can check it out. You'll notice that I did do a front view, which was kind of looking up at the character's head, and then a side view of the character's head. So we did have a front and a profile view there. And if you add these to the equation, then that makes 4 separate different viewpoints that we've got of this guy's head. Now, I'll admit these are a little bit more refined. In fact, they're very, very refined, and I've really tried to, noodle out the details here and get a very clear look at exactly who this character is going to be and what they're going to look like. So, I'm taking a little bit of extra time here, trying to figure out what the nuances of this character is going to entail, what makes them unique, what makes them different from the other characters that are going to be in this story. You'll notice as well that at this point I've already gotten I've got those foundations sorted out. They're probably the most important for making sure everything's proportioned accurately. And then I've got the facial features drawn on. But then the other most important aspect that I'm trying to keep in mind here is, again, the shape of the head itself. That is one of the most important aspects, because if that isn't consistent across all the different depictions of this guy's head that I'm going to draw up, then there's going to be an issue. Okay, so you'll also notice that I'm adding in a beard here, and I didn't really like the way in which the beard was flowing just before, because so I erased it naturally, and the reason for that, it was a little bit too uniform. That was the main problem. And that is one thing that a lot of us run into when it comes to drawing hair of any kind, whether it be facial hair or the hair on the character's head, is that we're somewhat inclined, because, our mind tries to look for uniformity. It looks for patterns. It tries to look for levels of consistency, because it doesn't really like randomness. It doesn't like content that it can't sort. And so we have this natural inclination to start organizing the things that should really naturally flow in a random way. There's always going to be some level of logic to the way in which hair flows, but and other natural elements within your character. But at the same time, you do want to try to make sure that it doesn't look too manufactured, right? Which is really what we're going to be doing here with this particular character's goggles, right? So you might remember in the previous concept that I'd kind of whipped together a very rough diagram of some of the headgear that he would wear. Now, if you're just coming to this video and you haven't really seen or heard about this character before, I've really only mentioned him in one other video, but he's essentially supposed to be a biomechanical engineer. Okay, so he manufactures robots or augmented bodies, right, that people's consciousness can be downloaded into. All right, so this is just a really, really rough, vague idea that I've got for a comic book that I may or may not get round to in the not too distant future. We will see. But it is an idea that has kind of stuck around for a while, as I've said, and I haven't really been able to shake it. I haven't been able to let it go. So, I thought I may as well do something about it and do up a bit of a concept here. And I really like the way that this guy turned out. Like, he looks like someone. He looks like a person. Who did I base him off? That might be something that you're wondering. Initially, you're not going to believe this, but I actually intended to base him off of Jake Gyllenhaal. And I used Jake Gyllenhaal, the guy from Donnie Darko, as a reference for both this concept and the previous concept. But the funny thing is that this guy did not come out looking like Jake Gyllenhaal at all. In fact, this dude is more, he looks more like a Guy Pearce or even the top concept there with the 3/4 angle view of him. It looked almost like Hugh Jackman's Wolverine in a weird way. In fact, I was a bit worried that it looked a little bit too much like Hugh Jackman's Wolverine. But, I mean, all of this is to say that ultimately your characters are just going to take on their own life. They're going to take on their own appearance. And the more that you draw them, the more that you refine them, the more that they're going to mature, rather. Chewbacca? Have I got Chewbacca on the mind? I don't know. But they're going to mature. And that is something that you're going to find, is that you're going to see your characters just... They're not going to look the same as they did when you first drew them later on down the line. They're going to become their own thing. And I think that that's really cool, actually. You want to see that progress within a character, because I think that it adds this extra level of believability to them. It almost gives them a life of their own, where they're becoming older, they're becoming wiser. They may not look like that physically necessarily in the comic book, but it's more in your style and the way in which you depict them. And it's not something that you intentionally do. It just comes from the repetition and the confidence that you get from drawing them over and over and over again. It's like if you were to draw Superman for the first time, it'd feel strange at first if you've never drawn Superman before, and you'd kind of be trying to figure out, how do I present Superman? What's my take on Superman specifically? And it may not even come out right the first time. It may not be what you wanted to go for. And I'm sure many artists who have drawn these popular characters like Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, they've all tried to implement a little bit of themselves into the design, for better or for worse sometimes. But it's not until later on that they start to redraw this character over and over again that they really start to figure out, okay, this is my Superman. This is how I present Superman. And again, it becomes their take. It's Superman, but in their style, in the realist form. So this dude has this protective headgear because he's a biomechanical engineer. And someone did suggest, when I posted out this concept, that I give him some kind of protective gear on top of his head, like a helmet of some kind. But he's not really a construction worker. He'd be more of like a mechanic. So there's not going to be heavy metals hanging over his head or anything like that he's got to look out for. And one of the reasons that I'm able to confirm that is I actually jumped online and I looked up robotics engineer to see whether or not they were wearing crash helmets to protect themselves. And what came up? It was that weird video, you might have seen it before, of that robot, that creepy looking robot from the military that walks on 4 legs, but it's kind of like, it's like the back legs are an inverted version of the front legs. And so when it walks around, it looks super strange and weird. The way it moves, the way it rebalances itself when it's knocked off its balance. It's very, very creepy, right? But they have these robot technicians, these engineers who are kind of, making sure that, I guess they're testing out the robot, right? They're trying to make sure whether or not the programming is accurate, whether or not it's structurally sound, whether it is going to fall over when it's kicked, that kind of stuff. And I didn't see them wearing any protective headgear. They were just wearing kind of like, almost like science outfit. They weren't even as heavy duty as this guy. So yeah, and I think it's really important to make sure when you are creating a concept for a comic book or a video game or a movie or whatever it is you're creating, you want to do your research a little bit. It's just, you can't guess this stuff because unless you've got experience as a robot technician, for example, there's no way in the world that you're going to be able to present that accurately or know what to include within that design to indicate that that is indeed who they are, that they are a robotics technician. So yeah, try to do your research. That's the fun part, right? Read all the comics that you can read and watch all the movies that you can watch, and not only get the reference that you need, but get inspired. One of the things I love doing most, and what I am so looking forward to when I actually start to get into this comic book idea a little bit deeper and really begin writing out the script for it, is I'm going to put my favorite sci-fi movies into the DVD player, the Terminator, Alien, the old classics, and I'm going to watch them, and I'm going to have a notebook with me. I'm going to be writing down any cool quotes that I hear, any ideas that spring to mind. And we kind of I wrote up a blog post on this recently on the howtodrawcomics.net site, which, by the way, if you're enjoying these videos and you like more comic art tips, tricks, and tutorials, make sure you check it out, www.howtodrawcomics.net. I have been putting out tons of content on that site recently, and there's just been so much come out that I haven't even had time to announce it. We've had a new podcast that's just come out the other day. We had a video yesterday that I haven't even announced yet. What else do we have? Oh, a new comic book went up onto the comic book store. Yeah, we've got a comic book store, and I never promote it. No one even knows about this comic book store, which is just full of amazing comic books by some of the most talented independent comic book artists that I've seen. And it's one of the reasons that we got their book on there. But, again, just check out the site and make sure that you check it out regularly because, I'm pumping out the content and it's all for you guys. 99% of it is free. We've got a few courses on there if you want to look a little bit deeper into this stuff and get a bit more of a specialized take on the various aspects of comic book illustration. But again, a lot of it is free, so take advantage of that. I enjoy creating this stuff for you guys. So the more people that I can get it out to that it's going to benefit, the better. But where was I now? Yeah, I was talking about checking out your references and making sure that you're noting down the various things that inspire you and the ideas that come to mind. And the blog post that I put out was all about cliches, right? And whether or not they are a good thing or a bad thing. Usually when someone calls your work cliche, they're saying that it's unoriginal, that it's overdone, and maybe even a little bit boring. But I disagree. I think that cliches are simply a good indication that if your work is cliche, that you're probably onto something, because original ideas that don't become cliches don't become cliches for a reason. It means that no one probably took notice of them or was inspired by them enough to actually do their own take on it, right? Whereas if you look at cliches, it's like there's such a good idea, they're so profoundly impactful on the culture as a whole that sometimes they become their own stereotype. They become their own niche. They have a cult classic behind them. Sometimes they become an entire genre, right? Like if you look at all the sci-fi movies out there, I watch sci-fi movies because they are cliche. Like, I know exactly how they're going to end. I know what types of characters I'm going to see within them. I know that generally what type of narrative they're going to follow. Yeah, there are going to be these unique little takes on the genre here and there, but for the most part, the specific reason that I watch sci-fi movies is because they are a particular way. I know that they're going to be a particular way, and that's precisely what draws me to them. In fact, if there's a movie that comes out that I've never really heard of before, I can't fit it or categorize it into any genre in particular that I might be interested in, I'm not going to check it out. And I doubt that anyone in the same position as me would be willing enough to check it out either, because, you want to know whether or not you're going to like something, and usually your preferences are precisely what makes something a cliche. It's not really your comic book that is cliche. It's the fact that the people who are consuming it love it so much that they make it a cliche, that the other creators that are inspired by it redo it in their own way and make it a cliche, right? So, yeah, if someone says that your idea is like this other idea or like that other idea, which is, by the way, what happened with this character. I put this character out there, had some really cool comments on it, actually. A few people, one that really sticks out to me is someone said that the storyline that I'd come up with kind of sounds like Altered Carbon. And that excited me because now I want to check out this Altered Carbon movie or TV series or whatever it was. But that's the end of today's video demonstration. I really hope that you enjoyed it. Again, it's another quick one. It did go for a little while, but, we have so much fun here that time just seems to fly, unfortunately. But I will be putting out more comic art demonstrations and tutorials and, other tips and tricks when it comes to being a comic book illustrator and really harnessing your abilities. So I hope that you'll tune in with me next time. Thanks so much for watching. Again, if you'd like more comic art tips, tricks, and tutorials, make sure you head on over to howtodrawcomics.net, and I'll see you there. Until then, keep on creating, keep on practicing, and I'll catch you next time.